I don't know why I'm flipping my hands. I shouldn't do that. Ugh, I haven't done this for so long. Ugh, it's getting awkward. Do you want to come in? My dog always waits till I'm halfway through filming a video to want to come in. Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a while since my last video, but once again I have a bunch of excuses which you're not probably interested in. I feel like though I need to upload videos more frequently than kind of once every 6 months or whatever it's been lately. So just bear with me. I've had to move house a couple of times. As you can see, I've shifted backgrounds again. I know I'm not on the run or anything, but there are perfectly logical explanations, but I've had to have a few moves lately. This should be it for a while, so hopefully I can settle in, get back into a routine and try to upload more frequently again. That all being said, shush, like, let's just stop. You're not interested in too much. Okay. So in today's video, I wanted to talk about the saying Buckley's chance, or you've got Buckley's chance. I don't know if you're familiar with this saying, but it means to have like pretty much no chance, like little to no hope in something happening. I don't know if this saying is worldwide or if it's just an Australian thing. You're going to have to tell me. Comment below, tell me where you're from and tell me if this saying is a thing. The earliest references I could find to it here were in the 1880s in Australian newspapers, and they were referring to like sports matches, like saying that the team has Buckley's chance of winning. So that's frequently how it's sort of used, like, you know, you've got Buckley's chance of that happening or whatever, meaning it probably won't happen, like it's such a long shot. This saying is rooted in Australian history. This is partly why I'm interested to know if it's said anywhere else in the world. So yeah, do let me know about that one. But it's a pretty common saying here in Australia. I think most Australians would have heard it or use it themselves, but most people don't actually know the origin of the saying. So today I wanted to talk about who is Buckley and what's Buckley's chance. First, if you haven't already subscribed, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell because it really helps out my channel when you do. And I know that I haven't uploaded that frequently, but I promise I'll get better, so stick with me. So, William Buckley, he was born in the late 1770s in Cheshire in England, so somewhere between 1776 and 1780, we're not exactly sure, but he was raised by his grandfather. He went to school. He then was apprenticed as a bricklayer. Then he was caught receiving stolen cloth. So he didn't steal it himself, but supposedly knowing it to be stolen, received it, and you know how strict they were back those days, he was sentenced to transportation to Australia. So he left England in April 1803 aboard the HMS Calcutta, and he was actually sent to Port Phillip in Australia, which was a fledgling new sort of colony that they were trying to build up. So it's not Sydney and it's not Hobart. So those, like Sydney and Hobart in Van Diemen's Land, were the kind of earliest settlements. Port Phillip was kind of new. There was nothing there at that point. It's what's currently kind of Melbourne area. But yeah, at that point, no ships had really been going there. So the ship that he went on, it was sort of one of the first, and it was about building up that colony. So when they landed there was honestly nothing there. So Buckley was a skilled labourer. He, because of his bricklaying skills, I suppose, was particularly useful in a new colony where they were trying to build things up. So he was given some degree of freedom along with the other skilled labourers within the kind of camp. And that's not like, you might think, oh, they just escaped, but there was nowhere to escape to. They were in the middle of the bush, and the nearest like path out of there to Sydney, it was, the distance between there and Sydney was like 1,000 kilometers or like 600 miles. It's a really long way and not easy just to like walk out of there and go somewhere else. So even with the freedom, it's like, where would you go? So the new settlement kind of had some problems though. They lacked fresh water and the soil wasn't particularly arable. So they were like having trouble establishing what they wanted to establish there, and those in charge decided to abandon the attempt and to take the convicts instead to Van Diemen's Land. So in December in 1803, that was when they were going to do it, there was a big storm one night and a handful of the convicts, including William Buckley, decided to escape because they did not want to be going to Van Diemen's Land. Their aim was to escape and go to Sydney, but like I said, it was an extremely long way. Like, it's possible that they didn't quite comprehend how far it was, or maybe they would not have decided to do it. So when they escaped, they had brought along some rations with them, and they traveled up the coast eating their rations, and they foraged a little bit for like berries and seafood and stuff. And so they sustained themselves for a while, but once their rations ran out, they were really struggling. They had been avoiding any Indigenous camps along the way, and they decided at some point that they were just starving and that they were going to try to flag down. There was a ship out in the bay, and they tried to signal to the ship, but they couldn't get their attention. So most of the men decided to turn back and go back to where the original camp was, and Buckley alone decided to try his luck. So Buckley struggled along for a while. He set up a little hut and he tried to forage and tried to just find what he could and eat it. But he was malnourished and he was often dehydrated. He was really like not doing very well. He didn't really know how to survive out there. And he was quite sick with it. And one night he came across 3 Aboriginal people who, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the tribe name because I'll probably butcher it. But they fed him a meal of crayfish, and they befriended him a little bit. So, you know, that was wonderful. But then they were going to continue on their way and he didn't want to go with them, so he decided to stay. He eventually decided that what he would do was essentially follow back around to where the settlement had been, just to see if there was any more escaped convicts that were still there and maybe they could kind of band together. So he started traveling back down there, and while he was walking he came across an Aboriginal burial mound and it had a spear sticking out of it. So he picked up the spear and used it as a walking stick and continued going along his way. He then came across a handful of Aboriginal people, different ones, and they took him back to their camp because once again he wasn't doing too well. And there they thought that he was their deceased ancestor because A, he was carrying the spear, and B, apparently he was quite an unusual looking guy. So, I mean, he was white, so they must have seen white people before, I think, but he was 6'6", and back in those days that was like, I think almost unheard of. I've hardly come across anyone from that era that was so tall. So he would have been quite a striking kind of figure out there. So yeah, they decided that he was their ancestor and they took him in. Gonna try to pronounce it. Wallaranga tribe took him in. They rejoiced, they mourned, they celebrated his return. They took care of him, they fed him, and they basically incorporated him into their tribe. They went ahead and, I mean, this is a solid year after his escape. So basically he was on his own for around a year before this, and after this year, yeah, he is essentially embraced by them. And they taught him like survival, they taught him bush skills, they taught him how to hunt, they taught him how to like everything that he needed to know. He learned how to catch eels, he learned how like to prepare food, he learned essentially all of their traditions and culture. He learned their language, he learned absolutely everything from them. So even though they initially mistook him for a deceased ancestor, and you know, maybe they still continued to believe that, but he also shared with them sort of stories about England and stories about his life and just all the incredible things that he'd experienced too. So they had this like mutually beautiful relationship. Eventually, once he proved himself that he was able to hunt and fish and take care of like himself and things like that, he was given a wife by the tribe and he had a child with her. After a while, some of the other tribesmen got jealous and things changed and they took the wife back. But he accepted this graciously. He seemed to just go with the flow, like whatever their customs were or anything, he just accepted it. So he didn't put up any kind of fight or anything. It was just, okay, this is the way things are. He seemed to be a very relaxed, kind of chilled guy that just embraced all of their culture. And yeah, he just didn't, it's not like he tried to turn them into, he didn't act like he knew better or like his culture should be pushed onto them. He very much embraced their culture. Because he had this so sort of peaceful way about him, he became this really revered and respected kind of figure in their tribe. And despite him becoming an expert at a lot of things, like he knew how to hunt, how to use their weapons, he knew all of these things, but they would never let him participate in any kind of tribal like warfare, because he was this figure that was, it was almost like they always looked to him for advice and guidance and things like that. So yeah, it was interesting. He was a part of their tribe, but he was almost set apart as well, if that makes sense. Most of the members of the tribe were killed in sort of a little tribal warfare battle between like them and another Aboriginal tribe. And at that point, Buckley decided just to go it alone again, and he set himself up just alone. But he had all of these skills now, knowing how to look after himself and how to find food. So he was alone for a while again, but eventually some of the surviving members of the tribe found him and they sort of got back together again. So essentially he went back and forth for years, just either living by himself or sometimes living with certain tribe members. And he didn't really want to have contact again with the white settlement because he was afraid that he would be essentially like a convict again. Kind of like he was an escaped convict. So he was a bit nervous to ever like signal boats or anyone who was around. He was out there for like 30 years doing this like living on the land thing. And in that 30 years, apparently he mostly forgot English. I mean, probably because he just wasn't using it at all and he was speaking the language of the Aboriginal tribe that he was with. So yeah, like it's crazy to think that you could forget your like native language, but he seemed to mostly forget it. Like 30 years is a really long time to be living under different kind of customs and different, you know, ways of life. So yeah, it was I think just over 30 years actually. It was in July 1835 that Buckley made his reappearance into British sort of society or Australian society, whatever we want to call it. In July 1835, a ship landed and Buckley learned that some of the Aboriginal people were going to go and murder the people on the ship and take the stuff, the goods from the ship. And he decided that he did not want that to happen, so he decided to intervene. Him and a handful of other Aboriginal people went to the ship and warned them, and it was really, I think, must have been surreal. The captain of the ship saw this like white guy, like who was essentially living as an Aboriginal. He had a tattoo on him that said WB, like William Buckley, and that ended up being how they identified him as who he was. I'll read you a quote from the journal of somebody who was aboard the ship. About 2 o'clock, a white man came walking up to the native huts, a most surprising height, clad the same as the natives. He seemed highly pleased to see us. We brought him a piece of bread, which he ate very heartily, and told us immediately what it was. He also informs us that he has been above 20 years in the country, during which time he has been with the natives. He then told us his name was William Buckley. Being so long with the natives, he has nearly forgot the English language, but the natives' languages he can speak fluently. So yeah, it was his tattoo that kind of confirmed that he was the escaped convict. But, you know, they'd given him up for dead. He was presumed dead 30 years previous. They did not expect to find him again. So Buckley was given a pardon and he was employed by the government as an interpreter because he spoke the native languages fluently, which nobody else could do. In 1836, he joined a party of men for a trip. And as they were traveling, here's a little excerpt which I loved reading. I thought this was really interesting. February 5th, 1836, I directed Buckley to advance and we would follow him at a distance of 1/4 of a mile. Buckley made towards a native well, and after he had rowed about 8 miles, we heard a cooey, and when we arrived at the spot, I witnessed one of the most pleasing and affecting sights. There were 3 men, 5 women, and about 12 children. Buckley had dismounted and they were all clinging around him and tears of joy and delight running down their cheeks. It was truly an affecting sight and proved the affection which these people entertained for Buckley. Amongst the number were a little old man and an old woman, one of his wives. Buckley told me this was his old friend with whom he had lived and associated 30 years. However, he didn't rejoin them. By this time he had moved back into sort of English society or Australian society. I don't know what we call it at that time, but he apparently they were quite sad that he wasn't rejoining them. But it just really showed how integrated he'd become into their culture, and he truly had befriended them. It was very unusual for the time. So in his role as a interpreter and mediator, he did this for a while, but it became difficult because he was trying to balance these 2 cultures that were at odds with each other in a lot of ways. He cared deeply for the Aboriginal tribes that he had spent so much time with, and you know, but he was himself part of white society as well. So he was trying to get these like outcomes, but neither side quite trusted him because, you know, the Aboriginal people saw him as in a way like deserting them and going back to this other thing, and the British saw him as compromised because he'd spent so long with these tribes that he seemed in a lot of ways to be one of them. So neither side quite trusted him, and eventually he ended up leaving the role because it was just I think too hard for him. And he was, as we saw before, quite like a peaceful kind of guy, and he probably just found it too stressful. So Buckley ended up moving to Hobart and he got married and ended up just working a few different jobs there, like not kind of in that field at all anymore, just working, you know, as a storekeeper and just things like that, unrelated. So he lived out the rest of his days there. He eventually died when he was thrown from a gig. He was 76 and his injuries, he sustained pretty bad injuries and died from that. But yeah, that is William Buckley, like in a nutshell. I just rambled about him. He's such a fascinating character because it's so rare back then that anyone experienced, like truly experienced both cultures. And, you know, this convict kind of guy from England has lived in a way that probably nobody else really did. I don't know if there's any story like it. And you can now see why they're saying you've got Buckley's chance, where that came from, because, you know, he has escaped as this convict and then come back 30 years later when everyone thought that he was dead. The fact that he survived out there and even thrived, it is so remarkable. Like, you know, most of the convicts who escaped into the wilderness, they were never seen again. Like, the odds were astronomical, but he somehow did so well. So Buckley's chance. Next time you say it, or next time you think about, like, if someone says it to you, like, now you know who Buckley is and why it is such a crazy, like, why the odds are impossible. Like, how does that happen? It's so crazy. Anyway, if you want to learn more about it, there's actually a book, The Life and Adventures of William Buckley. It was actually written in his lifetime. He didn't write it himself because he couldn't read and write. But yeah, an author was just fascinated by the story and wrote it for him. But yeah, that's Buckley and why we say Buckley's chance. Alright, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and learning a bit about William Buckley and why we say that people have Buckley's chance. Please do let me know in the comments what your thoughts are, especially if you're from overseas. I do want to know if you guys say it over there or if you've even heard of it. And yeah, let me know what you think of the story. It's so fascinating. Alright, I'm truly wrapping it up now. I have trouble with the intros and outros of these videos these days. Like, I'm still like getting back into the habit of actually talking to the camera, so I'm like, how do I end it again? Okay. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon in my next video. Bye!